In this presentation over both readings from this week, we will cover some of the topics from both the textbook and from the article. The topic of both of those pieces of text is acquisition of grammar. Grammar, as defined by our Lowen text, is the system and structure of a language. We all have descriptive grammar, which is what we use when we speak comfortably, and opposite that we have prescriptive grammar, which is the official and correct way to speak a language. ISLA researchers are concerned with the way people actually use their language to communicate, i.e. descriptive grammar. In addition to defining grammar, Lowen also defines morphology, which is the study of grammatical components that make up a word, and syntax, which is how grammatical components of a sentence work together. Sometimes in sentences, the features of the text are rule-based, and sometimes they're item-based. L2 learners have an interlanguage. It is a system that allows them to produce grammatical forms and is restructured as a new linguistic input as information is added. ISLA should examine L2 interlanguage on its own terms. Processability theory doesn't affect or change classroom setting, but it is what teachers and students should expect as an outcome. Many researchers agree that there is an order as to how many grammar concepts are developed. Some evidence has been found that indicates most learners go through similar stages of grammar development. Processability theory would be one of the other theories that supports these findings. The order in which grammar is acquired depends solely on the human cognitive system. A person cannot truly learn an advanced grammar structure if they haven't acquired the previous simpler grammar structures. Krashen's input hypothesis says that grammar cannot be learned as a result of instruction. One can only acquire grammar through the input they are exposed to. So, according to Krashen, teachers don't need to worry about what instruction method they use to teach grammar. Instead, teachers should try to make the classroom a place where students can get as much input as possible. Scheffler, on the other hand, argues the opposite. He says that direct, explicit instruction is the best way to learn grammar and is in favor of some traditional methods of instruction like explicit instruction and present, practice, produce, which we will cover on the next slide. While Chapter 4 discussed some implicit types of focus on language, this chapter focuses on more explicit types of instruction. When using consciousness-raising tasks, the students are expected to come up with the specific grammar rule based on the material they have been given. This instructional method forces students to focus on patterns and verbs in order to find the answer. The next method is input-based instruction. Students are provided some sort of input, audio or verbal, emphasizing a specific grammar structure. Students then have to demonstrate that they comprehend that specific grammar structure. Input-based instruction is very similar to input enhancement, which we saw in the previous chapter, the only difference being that in input-based instruction, the focus is mainly on the form and not on the meaning. Processing instruction is an approach that falls directly under the input-based instruction method. What it basically says is that second language learners process that language using their first language processing strategies. The objective of this approach is to make the student realize that the way they are processing the second language is wrong. Now we are going to change gears from input-based instruction and start discussing output-based instruction, which basically focuses the instruction in activities where the student is the one producing the language most of the time. One of these activities is the PPP, present, practice, produce. In this activity, the student is first presented with the information for a grammar structure. They are then prompted to use this new grammar structure to make sentences. After practicing, they may use this grammar structure to carry out a more relaxed conversation. The comprehensible output hypothesis attempts to achieve L2 development through the student's own production of language. One activity that falls under this hypothesis is when the student is asked to reconstruct a text that has been given to them orally or through audio. Finally, explicit instruction is basically when students are shown specific linguistic features, most of the time including examples. Then they would be required to demonstrate their knowledge after being explicitly instructed over particular grammar features. The research covering grammar instruction, Lowen points out on page 87, has focused almost exclusively on its effectiveness in bringing about L2 development rather than its value in promoting noticing of L2 structures. Lowen discusses several studies and activities while presenting input-based instruction. He particularly emphasized that comprehension-based instruction may be more effective if processing instruction is also present. Basically, both production-based instruction and comprehension-based instruction can be combined to meet various instructional needs. In addition, he mentions that there has been very little ISLA research on the topic of output-based instruction, and furthermore that explicit instruction in the studies that he has compiled in this text have shown explicit instruction is generally more effective with regard to grammar than implicit instruction. Explicit instruction is also best for learners who have very little exposure to L2, so students who might be new to whatever learning environment for their second language. Some suggest that there should be more implicit instruction than explicit instruction, sort of like Krashen, but consequently for a most effective classroom should probably be a blend of both implicit and input-based instruction and explicit sort of direct teach type modeling. The pedagogical implications for all of the information we have just covered and you all have just read about are that many types of instruction can be effective. Lowen uses this section in the text to reiterate that explicit instruction can be beneficial to learners as well. In addition, he suggests that teachers understand what grammar structures present a problem to learners and adapt those lessons accordingly. Lastly, Lowen states that the best type of L2 instruction may be that which integrates both implicit and explicit types of instruction. The article that Lowen referenced and that was part of our reading for the week by Spada and Tomita had some driving questions. Two of them were, do the effects of explicit and implicit instruction vary with simple and complex features in the short and long term? In the study, Spada and Tomita concluded that explicit instruction is more effective with regard to both simple and complex features. They do admit in a caveat that the way that you define explicit instruction, simple and complex, can impact the outcome of the research. And so they suggested that more research needs to be done and attention has to be given to how terms like implicit, explicit, complex, and simple are defined. The second question that drove their study, do the effects of explicit and implicit instruction lead to similar types of language ability for complex and simple forms? They concluded that there is no clear answer. Many of the studies contradicted each other and consequently more research needs to be done. So we have some research possibilities and inconclusive points at the end of this chapter. What type of grammar instruction has positive implications for students' output production is something that Lowen suggests needs to be researched more. And the article that I just discussed what are the different effects of implicit grammar instruction and explicit grammar instruction on learners' language ability. The references are here, and I and Jennifer look forward to seeing you guys' thoughts about all the interesting articles and points and activities that the text mentioned. And you guys can look for the questions in the discussion board posting.